I'll try to meet and have single currents.
Remember that you like soccer?
Those guys still think it's gonna work.
I wouldn't.
Remember that guy Haley?
Passport.
Before my time, but yeah, he's.
Man, he was.
How about the entire world is upon the sea?
Man, that guy.
But then we moved on. I have eaten bugs. I have not yet lived in them.
Yeah, he played in the States.
I don't know if you're it'll probably never happen until that to me. But if you're living in
Yeah, he won,
What's the word?
what's that?
Yeah.
He played
Make sure people back her.
World Cup,
People
and some countries.
I love how
lost,
people
and
still
they
think
got
that the European Union will
field goal. His
Is
own.
that what happens?
Yeah, he accidentally kicked his own
Yeah.
score.
the single currency in that part of the world is
And
very
the field
you're
then,
into it.
now back to the front.
Yes, which is a very selfish motive. I also like that people think that religion is like country.
Yeah. All
It's also funny when people think that Belgium is an actual country. Yeah, it's not. Yeah. It's just a piece of land that lives between France and Germany, so that we will fight.
Yeah.
I have a deep-seated bias against the little countries. They weird me out. They weird you out. It was just like off-brand to Germany. Germany weirds me out. They're Kirkland, Germany. German flavored sparkling water. It's a real German drink. This is just sparkling water.
The US ever won the World Cup.
Not actually opening, but it was for some the Olympic countries, and then Olympics, somebody has to jump up and open the door. They don't bell. All right, friends, we're gonna just get started right now. We have a lot to cover. So, and I have a hard stop at like 3:55. So, I want to make sure that we get through all of this. So let's just quickly begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Mary, seat of wisdom,
Pray for us.
in the Father, and the Son.
Amen.
Amen. All right, so let's just sort of remind ourselves where we've been. Last year we dealt with the term of the millennium. So what's stuck with you guys? Or are there any sort of lasting questions?
What resources would you recommend about the East-West? We didn't talk about it much.
Right. What resources would I recommend about the East-West schism? It's a good question, and I don't have one off the top of my head because I want to verify. But, yes. Sorry. What's stuck with you?
The church and state, there is a concept of separation there, but it's more like they're distinct entities and they're very closely intertwined, two of them.
Correct. And so what therefore what has that meant for the development of the church? What are some of the consequences?
A lot of things, good and bad.
Let's just name it.
Kings are seen as sort of, I think the term was pious overseers of bishops.
Charlemagne, but
Charlemagne has a huge hand in spreading certain customs and practices, a lot of Roman liturgy. The rise of Benedictine form of monasticism is kind of his thing. Because that creates a unity in his empire.
fair. The Benedictine monasticism was there 200 years before Charlemagne.
But he's popularized.
Very much so. What are some of the consequences of the relationship between church and state?
The immoral is also illegal.
The immoral is also illegal. Yeah, so you had, so in one sense, church law was also civil law, that the sort of the principles of Christianity were those that really did were those principles underlying civil law, right? And it assumed everybody being Catholic, right? And that's just the structure of which social order was organized. What about the relationship of how power is shared or not shared?
Daily to the church where they could find the rich narration.
Right, so
it was
benefices, and so you begin to see a growing level of, it's not just about the ideal of the office. You have that sort of the human corruption coming in, where ecclesiastical offices are often used as political pawns to promote particular non-religious agendas, right? This close relationship between authority, influence, that was a very easy line to blur, and created a system where, you know, power could be easily obtained, and influence easily obtained, sold, etc. Because of the assumptions of the relationship of Christianity to the organization of the civil society. I'm going to say something. Or, no, just switch.
On that note, many times the quality of the spiritual leadership suffered because of political involvement in pointing where even just that familial dynasties.
Yes.
Virtue.
So you said spiritual authority suffered. Is that really true?
Well, with like a 14-year-old pope.
So spiritual authority might not have been in the papacy. Where, but did people have spiritual authority with which they sought?
Their parish priest.
Monasteries? Monasteries. Monasteries became a spiritual center for many Christians. They were naturally looking to the hierarchy, maybe a parish priest, absolutely. But the monasteries, the monastic way of living, the Orana Gregora, it was a very visible sign about what Christian living can look like and the ideals. And they were also very learned. They had the libraries. They were centers of construction for the big cathedrals, et cetera, et cetera. So monasteries became a huge center for where people looked for something, for the spiritual sustenance, and maybe less so in Ireland. What else? So how does the state, the relationship between church and state, so just in continental Europe, post Charlemagne, what did that do to the relationship between bishops and the Pope?
I just had it in mind. Lay investiture became extraordinarily common, to where the primary force in picking a bishop was often the secular ruler, as opposed to the Pope or like a cathedral chapter or something like that.
So the Pope himself is a sovereign as well as, the vicar of Christ, has states, he has territory. And so the political and spiritual relationship that you might have with other sovereigns, right? The bishoprics can often be used as those political pawns in those sort of international or, interkingdom politics. But also, what is the power of a bishop in a feudal system?
Depending where you are and when, we like princes.
Right. And they could be very often there on the ground like local lords, while the king and the pope are very, very far away. Right? And it takes a long time to communicate. In many respects, there's a lot of, in this instance, subsidiarity, right? Sort of at work by necessity. And to have, so particular bishops, and depending on their relationship with local lords and sovereigns, may be more allied with the sovereign than with the pope, like that creates a thing. But also the authority and influence that a bishop can hold may very well, we see the role of conciliarism sort of rise, particularly in the 12th century. What is conciliarism?
Governance by council.
Governance by a council. Like we said, in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, there were 8 councils. In the next 600 years, we had 11, right? All of a sudden, the council became a mechanism where power can, be exchanged or wielded as a block over and against the Pope maybe. And you might have had sort of a weaker Pope for a variety of economic and political reasons, right? Given the sort of political, diplomatic relationships that are at play, and what that means. So again, you have, there's an interesting interplay here. So in one sense, in many respects, this relationship between church and state, doesn't root out evil, we learn, but it could also be a good thing of, having a society that practices the faith regularly and openly, right? And at the same time, we see how that the dark side of that relationship, when it's that closely tied, it's a double-edged sword. Yes.
There's also, especially with the papacy, I was just saying why I don't think papal states are a good idea today, right before class, but in this era of sovereigns, where the Pope is the supreme spiritual power, it makes a level of sense that he would have temporal power as well, because if you're in this kind of society with lords and duchies and kings and emperors all over the place, the Pope having his own territory provides a kind of buffer against all of those things, and it kind of protects the papacy in a sense.
Yeah. So where maybe the spiritual center is not seated in the hierarchy, the spiritual models, the spiritual influences. And we know a lot is in the monasteries, we see a trend is that where the sort of the hierarchy may fail, you begin to see that gap filled by other places. So monasteries is one thing. Where is another thing that started to arise out of the lack of sort of hierarchical leadership in spiritual life?
Us.
Yes, the Dominicans. So there's 2 sides to this. One, you have sort of an unchecked, tone-deaf like, and a tone deafness with regards to the preaching of the gospel and wielding sort of theological or in this case, spiritual authority. And you had a lot of charismatic preachers rising up, but interpreting the gospel in ways that are not akin to the gospel. You know, we had a neo-Gnosticism, neo-Manichaeanism. So you had, and it was very popular because it was also a reaction against the ostentation and the corruption often that they saw of the hierarchy. And so a new form of religious life blossoms in this era as a check. It wasn't a top-down thing, we're going to do this. It was a really grassroots thing, born out of an experience. Dominic and Francis go and tell the Pope we want to do this versus the Pope says, I'm going to start doing this, or Bishop saying, I'm going to start doing this. They saw the need, it was very grassroots. There was a lot of other grassroots movements as well. Lay reform movements, right? A grassroots reform movement, we're gonna reform ourselves. You know, we're gonna make sure that we're living these ideals. So you had these apostolic living groups that focused on simple living, works of charity, the development of virtue. So a couple of groups were named the Pugliati, the Beguines, the Guards, right? And again, some can go astray, like the Cathars, the Albigensians, the Waldensians, etc. But you begin to see a lot coming up from the ground. If the top isn't able to provide, a lot comes from the ground. We will also see that in reverse, right? When the ground is not so helpful, the top really does step in, right? And there's this sort of checks and balances that goes on that way, the natural progression. So, but was everything so dark and bleak? Yes. You're not allowed to answer the next questions. Not minutes, questions.
No.
That sounded like a question.
When you started having urbanization, the flourishing of culture,
So you had a sort of a shifting economy, a new reality around how people were actually living with each other. So a rise of urbanization, which led to what? Cathedrals being one. What else?
Universities.
Universities. And who are often the ones? So what was the idea of an original university?
Let's get all the experts in one place.
Let's get all the experts in one place. Who tended to be those experts?
Priests.
And not just priests, religious, whether they be Franciscans, Dominicans, other. But you had other thinkers as well. But you began, and from different sciences as well, not just theology and philosophy, certainly part of it, but then you also had sort of the trade masters, you know, blacksmith guilds and carpentry guilds and glass wheels, masonry guilds, and became a center where people can be formed and learn in a centralized place, as well as maybe learn about other things as well, right?
So didn't the universities predate the mendicant movements because they were like established and there was some controversy when so many Franciscans and Dominicans came in? Also, the kind of a second question, was there influence on, because some old universities seem to have almost a monastic structure, architecturally. Was there an influence on the monastery on the formation of universities as well?
I would say absolutely, but no, when, you know, universities in 1160, there were no universities. They were there in 1220. The Mendicants rise. I mean, Dominic was born in 1170. Dominicans were founded in 1216. Franciscans right near there. The burgeoning of what the university is And it's sort of finding you could have had the starting of a system, but it's only a couple decades old,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so the rise of the Mendicants and the rise of even the monastics' involvement in the idea of university, the births of them are really tied. And so I would say absolutely. We modeled the idea of a disputatio in the style of debate and learning and etc. Yes.
When making the connection too between the early universities and the guilds, in the sense that the university was kind of a guild for intellectual life. One thing I was wondering about is like how the payment system works for professors in those early days. My understanding is that part of it, like kind of taking from students directly what they did in offer for lectures was much more like a negotiated
Exchange, bartering system. I have no idea. That sounds very fascinating, right?
Father Dave said we begged to be allowed. So
Say that again?
Father Dave told us that we begged our ways
Yeah,
into the universities,
yeah,
which makes sense.
right. Now we have boards and tenure and et cetera, okay? It wasn't there, right? It wasn't blossomed as pre-construction, prefabricated thing. So you have so it's not all as dark. There was an absolutely vibrant and one of the most important, perhaps the first really major theological golden age of the Roman Church. Of the Roman Church. Is the Scholastic era. Starting with Saint Anselm, through Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Peter Lombard, all the greats there. It's a real boom in the intellectual golden age. First, there are subsequent ones, but does that make sense? For the Roman Church. So not
You
all
consider
the
that golden age, like apart from individual brilliant people like, an Ambrose or an Augustine. This is more like a collective intellectual golden age, but like a scholastic movement opposed to just brilliant apostolic fathers and teachers. Not apostolic, patristic.
patristics.
Yeah.
Most of the patristics were East.
Yeah.
Right? But for the Roman Church, particularly up of Rome, it wasn't, yes, there were many brilliant, but it's not just the brilliant, there was a whole ethos about it. It was incredible output. And influential to this day about how we understand the faith, to talk about the faith, especially as Roman Catholics. Right? There wasn't an era with this kind of prior to this in the Roman Church. Rebuttals? All right. So we know about what else was going on in this. Something that so you had the power corruption, you had a feudal system that leads to a changing economy and urbanization. You have an intellectual and grassroots piety movement about surrounded around apostolic living and charitable works. What else was happening that affected everyone?
The plague.
The plague. It's like asteroids moving on. Again, the effect of the plague, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, 1/3 of the world's population died, living in and among illness, death, the fragility of life, right? The incertitude about how long someone can survive or live, etc. These are all things that affect everything. it affects like, we can't have too many kids, send them to the monastery, right? We can't do X, Y, send them to the monastery, or how people congregate or don't, the effect of the ability to do certain things, advancements in art and architecture, like, because you're worried about just living. Living is good, dying, not as good. It had political effects, right? Economic effects, spiritual effects. Death is all around you, just like if persecution is all around you, the imminent threat of plague around you is going to affect the kinds of things you focus on, kinds of things you emphasize, because that's the sign of the times, right? And those are difficult things to separate, because religion will always, always, always be incarnate in a people. You cannot separate religion and a people, and therefore economics, environment, language, geography, history, politics, the faith gets expressed through that lens, all those lenses, right? And in certain areas, we might highlight one thing, in other areas, we might highlight another. So it's an interesting thing to know about the context as well. All right. So where did we end? Well, sort of the last event that we sort of dealt with, besides the plague, was a sort of over blanket over all of it.
The end of the Western Schism.
The end of the Western Schism. What was the schism?
The papacy moves from Rome to Avignon. It's there for 80 years, and then returns to Rome, and then there's another pope in Avignon, and then there's a pope in Pisa.
There were competing claims, right? Pisa, Rome, Avignon, and it was scandalous. Everybody knew it. My dear sister, Sienna, goes to the Pope in Rome at the age of 30 something, early 30s. She dies when she's 33, so I think it was when she was 32 or 33. It was shortly before she died. Get back to Rome. How do they solve the issue? How do they end the schism?
They have all the popes resign and lock the cardinals into a conclave and have them decide who the pope is going to be.
And who is that?
Martin V.
Martin de Cinq.
French?
I don't.
Okay.
I just decided to use that accent. Who called it her? Who sort of pushed the council?
Sure.
Was it a pope or was it a king? It was a king.
Sigmund?
Sigismund. You were very close, brother. Of Luxembourg, Hungary, Austria. He pressured the claimant in Pisa, John the 23rd, not of our beloved. Oh God! What's wrong with Yoko? Yoko. What? Watch the movie, everybody. So this is at the turn of the 15th century, right? Beginning of the 1400s. What does that do after this big split and just whatever? Everybody's like, why can't they just live right? Why can't the hierarchy just sort of, there's a frustration, a fatigue about leadership. Martin V is not a strong figure. He's not Charlemagne. He's not a Leo, who can ride out and meet Attila the Hun. He's not Gregory I or Gregory VII or a Leo IX, who went and traveled through Europe preaching reform type of thing. There was a decree that came out in there called Frequens, which basically said that a council is the best method of governing and is to be held frequently. It gave a timeline and how a council was to be called and how often. Frequency, right?
Then what, this was,
This was in the Council of Constance. We're now in the, we're in the last four notes. Franklin's. The Pope is a weakened figure. He is more of a spiritual figure, or maybe even more of a ceremonial figure. You know, we might trot him out for certain things, but his influence is very, very weak. Power that he wields practically is very little, even though he's the Pope. I mean, there's a lot of, he's controlled by many. There were attempts at post-Constance councils that were tried to be called, one in Siena, one in Pavia, but it proved difficult logistically and politically because of all the sort of complicated relationships, et cetera, of this, what we've been talking about in relationship between church and state, et cetera. The next council actually takes place in 3 different locations, moved for a variety of reasons. Sometimes these 2 councils, Constance and then Basil Ferrara Florence, sometimes it's referred to as the Council of Constance Basil Ferrara Florence. But there's a 15-year gap-ish, a little under 15-year gap between the end of Constance and the beginning of Basil Ferrara Florence. And it really does manifest the struggles. This council manifests much of the struggles of the different factions. Between the different factions, there's popes and bishops, there's national interests, there are personal interests. And with this idea of the frequency of a council, right? There was this sort of beginning to rise the idea, well, I'll just wait to the next council and I'll get my guy in, right? And so there was a lot of that political maneuvering. Maybe I'll just wait for the next election year. This is an election year, I can wait until, et cetera, et cetera. And the councils basically had the authority over popes. And what this does to the papacy is sort of the councils and this sort of group mentality of the bishops as a college began to really instill, at least in the institution of the papacy, a bit of a fear of councils. Right? How can I wield my authority as Pope, as the vicar of Christ, as the successor to Peter, you know, when this has become the norm and I'm being boxed out, etc. But you begin to have that growing because of the tensions and because of just human corruption and etc. You begin to develop that deeper root of bishops versus Pope versus bishops. And this is going to continue to today.
how much of the Western Church were these councils involved? Were they fairly local? Or were they...
No, these councils were the Western. You have to think about it too, like, so you had the different kingdoms, France, England, Luxembourg, Austria, Germany, Spain, right? They were all there. Italy, Lombards versus the Sicilians and Papal States. I mean, all of that was part of the Western Church. And there was that interval.
Were there some councils that only local areas of
Yes.
bishops as well?
So again, our understanding of every bishop is there is modern. When we get to Trent, we're going to talk about, you might actually put it here. No, I don't put it here. Trent has like 3 or 4 different periods. First period, there was only like 12 bishops. Next period, maybe 40, next period, 100, right? But that wasn't necessarily the concern. So we have to be careful not to project back. I don't even think, even in those ecumenical councils, everyone was there, right? Or everyone was expected to be there. I don't know that for sure, but again, our modern conceptions and how we've seen the council, it has evolved over time. So, so again, to note that then this tension and the power between bishops and pope, you have bishops and sovereigns, bishops with sovereigns against the pope, pope and sovereigns against bishops, you know, bishops and sovereigns against, like all, we have these dynamics at play, right? And they get complicated the longer we go in history, the further we go in history. So, and also then at the end of the 15th century, you know, the last quarter, this was the papal age of something bad, right? There are Netflix series made about this era called Borgias. We might call them the Borgia popes. This is the Medici family. This is the time of Michelangelo, et cetera, et cetera. There was high spending, high debts, bribing of elections. With a new economy on the rise, you very much had, you know, the great economic powers like the Medicis being able to put their guy in by the papacy, et cetera, et cetera. There was rampant nepotism, you know, nephews being made cardinals, right? Nephews of not necessarily nephews. So,
This is a double meaning.
so for example, let's just go Sixtus the Fourth. He was a Franciscan. He's the first Sixtus since the 5th century, right? So if anybody wants to be Sixtus the Sixth, it might be a name to take, because we haven't had a Sixtus since. He's the one that actually constructed the Sistine Chapel. He created the Vatican Archives. He canonized Saint Bonaventure. But he was shamelessly nepotistic. There were two big families, Della Rovere and the Viario, families of which he was related to. 6 of the 34 cardinals that he appointed were his nephews. But then we get the very infamous Alexander VI. Dante writes about Alexander VI. Right? He's in hell. He's in the inferno.
I think he also writes about Sixtus
You could write about Sixtus too.
and Boniface.
Dante wrote in the 1300s.
No, he was.
Dante, he was 1308 to 1320 was when he was writing the poem.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought it was more of the time of the kind of Florence and the Italian Renaissance.
No. Now 1265 to 1321.
He's a precursor of the Renaissance.
Gotcha. I am mistaken.
Of what we would call actually Italian Renaissance.
But even then, though, Dante writing and showing even at that time of the corruption that was already known in the 1300s, right?
Yeah.
Very known there. Again, reform had been attempted since thousands, right? With the reform movements that started with the Gregorian reforms. Get it together, right? This lay Lester and Simony, etc. They never, we're 500 years in and still quite haven't figured it out, right? We can't seem to shake the simony, right? The corruption. But Alexander VI, going back to him, became Pope in 1492. A lot happened then, right? That was a pretty momentous year in the history of the world. What else happened in 1492? Columbus sails. He doesn't find, I'm sorry?
The ocean blue.
Columbus sails the ocean blue. It's the era of Ferdinand and Isabella. This is the era of, we'll see, a great expanse. but you have the expulsion of the Jews and the Muslims from Spain, right? Sort of like, again, a Christian society, and you see the power of a king and queen over the church, right? Just a thing. Alexander VI, 1492 to 1503, had 9 kids, 2 of which when he was pope, right? And he was such a divisive figure. Our dear brother Savonarola, right? Of infamy and infamy, but certainly a flame. You begin to see too a lot the resistance from the local masses against the blatant corruption. You see, so Savonarola, Girolamo Savonarola OP, he was Florentine. He preached ferociously. He's often depicted by his detractors as a crazy street preacher, right? A scrupulous Puritan. Others called him a mystical prophet, right? Where the truth is, it's an interesting thing. He probably was a pretty hot-headed guy and preached very hot-headedly. But his arch nemesis was Pope Alexander VI. And he called out on him publicly and regularly against his corruption and just clerical abuse. He refused to join Alexander's fight against the French. So Alexander was calling upon the Allies against the French, particularly the Italians. And Alexander didn't like that. So he had it made that he was to be killed in 1498 by being burned at the stake, and of infamy, and certainly blame. He burned at the stake in the center square. He wasn't burned alone. He was burned with 2 other Dominicans, Brother Domenico and Silvestro Maruffi. When you go to Florence, you go to the main square there, and you will see on the floor a giant plaque in bronze, I think, or whatever.
It's marble, I think. It's just set in the.
It's set in the square, and it talks about on this spot, Savonarola, Domenico, and Silvestro were burned at the stake. And then right next to that is sort of like an open court yard with pillars, and then there's statues around, and in there we have Saint Antoninus.
What's that?
Who is ours, right? So the Dominicans are very much on the scene, particularly in the Italian scene, with regards to the corruption, and we have our saints, and there is, from what I do understand, there is, when we're looking at Savanarola's life, considering his cause.
See, Father Dave said that on retreat last week too.
Yep.
So
They when he was burned at the stake, they took the ashes and threw them in the river so that no one could get any relics, because there was already like clear signs that there would be a cult after his death.
right,
Wasn't he hung and burned simultaneously?
Yeah.
As one does.
They have his castle on display, and it's got little parts snipped out of it, and they're like, oh yeah, friars have taken like snips of this to all these different convents, and everyone's like, oh, I'm not taking this as a relic. Do not think I'm taking this as a relic.
but no, in Florence, so we have Maria Novella, Santa Maria Novella, which has some of the best, greatest paintings of Dominic Fra Angelico. Well, a lot of his paintings are there, but we also have St. Mark's, which houses.
That's where Antoninus is.
Yeah,
There's a lot of, in the convent attached to the church, which, well, that is the St. Mark's convent. That's the dormitory paintings of Fra Angelico.
so Florence was a hotbed for Dominican activity as well. So interesting. Julius II is the successor. Julius II of fame. Some of you may know him as Rex Harrison in the movie The Agony and the Ecstasy. Rex Harrison, for those who don't know Rex Harrison, you may know him as Dr. Dolittle from My Fair Lady. So very famous actor. And he plays opposite Michelangelo. Some of you may know Michelangelo by the name of Charlton Heston. But this is that era. And Julius II certainly was a powering figure, that kind of charismatic figure that begins to restore and take back sort of a power to one's own. He was Michelangelo's pope. So Sixtus the Fourth was his uncle. Everybody was bribed to elect him, but Julius stopped that practice. He really clamped down on that, even though it's what got him the papacy. He put the kibosh on it. He was a huge patron of the arts. He established the Vatican museums. He started the reconstruction of St. Peter's. He appointed Michelangelo as the head architect in 1506. He also fathered 2 daughters as cardinal. Right?
We won't have to.
He's also a bit of a warrior. He often went out on, battle campaigns. Of course. Because he's a sovereign, right? But, so, this is that age. Remember, this is the eve of the Reformation. Okay? In the midst of all of this, in the second half of, of the 15th century to 1400s, the church also does begin to deal, right? As, reforms have been attempted, don't stick, don't hold, fail miserably, some try, and the church has been dealing with it since the thousands, right? And we've seen different eras of that, and it continues to do so, but you begin to see the fatigue in people, right? And begin to have the rise of what will be known as humanism. We're going to bracket humanism for next class, because we're going to talk about that movement and its influence to the Reformation next class. But humanism, in short, is what we would know as like the return to the self. There was a beginning to look at the world through a personal lens by the everyday person and not an institutional lens. And this is where we have a fundamental shift in the history of the Catholic Church. What are the 2 questions that we're tracing?
Who is a Christian? Who has the authority to say so?
Who's a real Christian? Who has the authority to say so? And we've seen those definitions of Christians fluctuate. We've seen the authority has hands in a variety of different ways. All of a sudden, a 3rd question arises. And it adds a whole new dimension to this dynamic that will lead us to today. And that is, what about me? Who's a Christian? Who has the authority to say so? What about me? Am I a real Christian? Do I have the authority to say so? Where is my interests at? Right? You begin to have this very personalist, and this idea of the turn to the self really pushes that, where institutions fail. The society begins to get, there's only so much that they can bear. And they begin to, when they have to take care of their own, their world becomes smaller, less institutional. Who can they trust to look out for their interests? Who can they trust for real leadership beyond simply being a military might to stop foreign invaders, right? And then what about me? And you begin to have this sort of turn to the self, a questioning of one's own intelligence, one's own potential and ability, when that's not being communicated or guided from the top at all. People take it upon themselves to live right. And even though up here, there was a lot of craziness going on, and not a lot of really great models, you begin to have a real spiritual and virtuous renewal in this era, the second half of the 1400s. There was wide enrollment in confraternities, lay associations, priests' fraternities, these associations where we are going to model for each other this community orientation where one helps oneself, one helps another. There was, for example, something called the Oratory of Divine Love. An oratory, renewed spirituality, focused on pastoral concern. Pastoral concern meaning with the people, to the person, right? And caring for the everyday. There was a lot more structured piety, service to the poor. It almost looks like religious life. This is a lay association, right? But this is a grassroots things that burgeons up and creates and fills the need where those who, at least titularly, should be having the spiritual authority and guidance to meet these needs. And when that's not happening, well, they're going to find another way to meet it, right? There was another very popular movement called the Devotio Moderna. It was a spiritual movement of practical piety. And it was particularly in reaction to a heady intellectualism, scholasticism. We sort of have the resurgence of the echo of Tertullian's rant. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? I don't care how many angels can dance on the head of a needle, right? I don't care. What does that have to do with me and me raising my cattle? I'm learning a trade. What does that have to do with me? Where is that rigor? Where is that development and formation? We're not getting it, right? And so there's this big reaction to this, again, petty intellectualism that was out of the reach of the vast majority of Christians, as well as a highly mystical, speculative mysticism. This is where, though they may have been theologically brilliant or mystics themselves, it didn't help really practically marrying Joe Catholic in the quote-unquote pew. The Meister Eckharts, the Johannes Paulers, the Hildegards. It was speaking of a kind of a language that was not practical, right? So you get from this movement, one of the most important spiritual words that the everyday Catholic ever has had. De imitatione Christi, the imitation of Christ, right? Thomas à Kempis comes from this Devotio Moderna. And what makes it such an important work is that it is a practical handbook for everyday living, based in very practical experience. It was something that the everyday person could sink their teeth into, right? Today, many people, your sort of cradle Catholics on their bookshelves have Bible, maybe the Catechism, and the Imitation of Christ. At least in my grandparents' age, everybody had it. I inherited my grandparents and the invitation to Christ that dates to 1898. Pre my grandparents, right? It's cool, right? But that says something. Again, also a very practical piety for your blue collar worker.
I think it's the second most printed book. But check me.
Right? So, again, you need to, this is what's happening on the level. All of these things are swirling around, right? Another thing that starts to happen too, 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. This is the age of incredible expansion and exploration, initiative, and thus marks the another third fundamental shift in how the church identifies and expresses itself. Because up to this, so we had originally, you had sort of the Jews and the East and the Levant, and then for many it was the Mediterranean basin, Greeks, Jews, Roman Greeks, Jews, they were also the Mediterranean basin. After the fall of Rome, we moved north, and what happens?
Kind of stay there.
Kind of stay there. Who's there? A variety of tribes, a completely different cultural pool, DNA, a pool of imagery and symbols and sort of pagan spiritualities from which Christianity never grew from originally, but encountered and began to, as it did with the Greek and the Roman, begin to express itself. You know, the French and the Anglos and the Spaniards, the Goths, the Vandals, which turned into the Germans, et cetera, and the gene pool from the fall of Rome until 1492 had basically been just Europeans. And when that big expanse starts going out, an entire new set of cultures, languages, environments, politics, symbols, spiritual backgrounds begin to enter into the gene pool of Catholicism and our understanding of Catholicism like it never had before. And it goes into the New World, Asia, Africa. And what it also does, it fundamentally shifts how people see the world. Up until this point, the church understood itself. Spain was the Western outpost. Spain was the edge of the world. All of a sudden, Spain becomes the center. Right? We talk about the movement of the global south. This is a very similar moment. Yeah.
Speaking of the global south, what year is Guadalupe again?
31,
31.
30, I was going to say 38, something like that. Which is really telling. But yeah.
Just right as all this is happening.
Yeah. And what else is going to be happening?
And a few other things too.
But the Reformation.
Oh, right, that's what I was getting at. Like,
Yeah.
it's within 2 decades, it's within 15 years of the theses of one continent partially apostatizes, another, which is thus far been pretty unsuccessfully evangelized, suddenly takes off.
Yeah. 1498, Portuguese arrive in Calcutta. 1511, Antonio de Montesinos preaches his famous preaching against the maltreatment of the indigenous on the island of Hispaniola, along with his partner Bartolome de las Casas, who was a plantation owner and was converted by the preaching of the Dominicans. But the preaching of Antonio de Montesinos and the Dominicans of Hispaniola become the basis for international human rights law. In the midst of the rise of the slave movement. 1542, St. Francis Xavier arrives in India, and later in Japan, right? We have the Americans, where we get the seeds of the church in the Americas. Now note, The Catholicism that arrives in the Americas and takes root is a pre-Trent Catholicism, particularly in south of the States, in Canada. It's a pre-Trent Catholicism that takes its root. When the British come over, Plymouth Rock, the founding of the United States, the real evangelization of the Americas, that's a post-Trent, a post-Reformation Catholic Church that takes root. In many respects, Latin American and South American Catholicism is an interesting study to look at what some of those roots that were not influenced by how Catholicism gets expressed in light of the Reformation, European Catholicism, and to see what that is. Why the great preference for the passion of Christ with their well-bloodied Jesuses on their crucifixes and some of their devotionals and how they do that, and to trace the influences of a pre-Trent Christianity. What was Spain? What was the Church of Spain that brought over? It would be a very interesting study, but it is not the same Catholicism that seeds the U.S. and the Catholicism that we come to know, because the U.S. cultural base really is from a post-Reformation Europe. The Dutch, the British, the French, and how Catholicism begins to get expressed over and against its identity against what becomes like a Protestant identity. And those tensions and those ideas get imported to us at our root. Something very, 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 very important to understand about our Roman Catholicism in the United States, in the Midwest particularly, and where we came from. And it's a very segmented one.
Well, in Latin America too, you kind of have a cultural transformation similar to what happens in the middle of Europe from Rome, like you were just saying, that cultural shift up towards France and Germany happens in Latin America too, and does not happen in what we would consider now the United States. Like I once spoke to a Franciscan missionary to Native peoples down in New Mexico, and he described it as like what happens in Latin America is the same cultural weaving that's like created in medieval Europe, just now happening with a completely different indigenous people.
Right?
I mean, even till now, the assumption in at least Nicaragua, but most Latin America is if you're a Christian, you're a Catholic.
Yes. That's changing.
Yeah, it is, but
By evangelical Christianity, particularly Pentecostalism, charismatic. Why?
It's really interesting syncretism.
Yeah.
Very like Pentecostal style Catholicism.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
I think that's part of the risk of like Catholicism being so tied to the culture, because when the culture of either the Western world, or if you're moving up from Latin America to here, and the culture is more evangelical or Protestant or something, that shift becomes easier.
Yeah.
Because it's just the cultural tide that you're in.
Who were the main missionaries to the New World in this expanse?
Franciscans.
Jesuits.
Religious. If you go to the cathedral, because the Jesuits are not founded yet.
Oh.
The Jesuits are founded in like the Protestant Reformation. They do certainly take a part as this expansion movement begins to develop. We're at the beginnings of it. If you go to the cathedral in Panama City, the original cathedral there, which is right next to Santo Domingo, which was the Dominican convent, and they have sort of the names of all and real paintings of every bishop of Panama, and you just go at the beginning of the 1500s. Dominican, Franciscan, 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 Dominican, Franciscan, Dominican, 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 Franciscan, Dominican, Jesuit, Dominican, Franciscan, Dominican,
One of these.
Holy Cross, right? What? So you, again, one of the influence of religious life and therefore the spirituality of the mendicant orders, the spirituality of monastic life, is another thing that really seeds the spirituality and the Catholicism of Latin America. Interesting, right? So, hence the movie The Mission. Jeremy Irons and the young Robert De Niro, the young Liam Neeson, about Jesuit or Franciscan missionary Jesuits in near the Falls of Iguazu, Chile, Paraguay. So it's a great movie. If you've not seen it, see it. Right? After watching that movie, I ended up picking up the phone and calling the girl saying, I think I'm ready to enter now. No joke. So this is happening, right? But with all of the complexity, again, we've been in this 500 years of we've had schisms, we've had reform attempts, we've had conciliarism and fighting and all that sort of stuff. Humanism is on the rise. We begin to see the foments of discontent. And it wasn't just Luther. You have John Wycliffe, an English Oxford philosopher, in 1384, reacting against the concurrent skeptical movement. He begins to develop his own ideas of truth, etc., and translates the Bible into English. Jan Hus was a Czech priest, dies in 1415. Right in the middle of the Council of Constance. He was a priest theologian. He was a follower of Wycliffe and that Oxford movement. Dynamic preacher against clergy and corruption. He was invited to Constance under the guise of safe passage to defend himself and his ideas. When he got there, he was condemned and hung by secular authorities. And there is a big set of followers called the Hussites. Jan Hus. Again, our brother Savonarola is another sign of the foments of discontent. Right? The end is nigh. Was he a saint or was he a heretic? Again, we think of Savonarola and Alexander VI. But you also see in his era and even in his preaching the growth of satire of the church, which is indicative of the mood and the reality of the church. You have Archbishop Cisneros in Toledo, Spain, and he begins and takes on a set of reforms, at least in his area, the observanists' reforms. Basically, observe your vows. Simple ask. Observe your vows. Stay in your parishes and convents. Stay in your monasteries and priories and friaries. Observe your vows. Live them, for God's sake, literally. He founds the University of Alcalá, which becomes a humanist intellectual center. Restoration of classical lit that's less scholastic, right? Again, you have these movements against some of the headiness or the detached, and that can feel a little too like it's not meeting our needs. Major concerns of this era: the quality of pastoral care, high absenteeism of priests and bishops, but also a rise of very superstitious piety and low quality preaching to our accusal, or what do we call that? To our, culpability or whatever too. But in general, very low quality preaching, corruption in the church, inept priests, nepotism, corruption in the papacy. And this links into philosophy and theology and creates extremes in philosophy and theology that leads to schism. Jan Hus, Wycliffe are indicators of those extremes, or at least leading to those spectrums, just like we had in the 1200s with the Albigensians, the Waldensians, the Cathars, these neo-Gnostics, right? It's the same thing that is reasserting itself 300 years later. So how bad was it really? Before we take a break, we're gonna end on this. I printed this out for you guys. I'm sorry online. I didn't send it, but I could send it in the next Flocknote. How bad really was it? John O'Malley, one of my favorite church historians, so this is probably Dave Munson too. He's written 3 big books. First one was What Happened in Vatican II. The second one was What Happened at Trent. The third was What Happened in Vatican I. And those 3 were like these big capstone projects, giving a historical research look at the modern councils to how it led to the church today. He's had a couple side books that really influenced it. 2, he had one, things that every Catholic should know, church history that every Catholic should know today. He wrote a small little essay, When Bishops Gather, which was sort of like a capstone essay after he finished What Happened in Vatican I, summarizing and putting together sort of a meta conclusion. Really, really, really wonderful and brilliant. He's a great writer. But in the beginning of these books, he does sort of a contextualization leading up to the councils. Trent, Vatican I, Vatican II. So this is in him, the 15th century prelude is the chapter. And this is what so the question is, how bad really was it? Because we can have a picture painted of doom and gloom, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to read this to you. Reformers like Savonarola denounced their times as the worst of all. Although they cannot be taken at their word, abuses in the ecclesiastical system were widespread, extending far and beyond Rome and Victoria. Right? A little bit of today. This is the worst era of the Catholic Church we've ever seen. Right? And yeah, it's true. Abuses were found in the ecclesiastical system, so an hard thing. The most obvious of them was the absence of bishops from their dioceses, which seemed to betray that they had little interest in the spiritual welfare of their flocks. Same holds true for pastors of parishes. This situation put into jeopardy the church's pastoral mission, the only reason for its existence. Although churches were full and religious practice high, reformers denounced the quality of the latter as arithmetic, formulaic, and based on the assumption that performance of certain ritualized acts obligated God to respond in favorable ways. Superstition and ignorance of the basic tenets of Christianity were, according to them, rampant, especially in the countryside, and principles of Christian morality everywhere flouted. The gluttonous monk, the lecherous friar, and gullible priest were commonplaces in the satire. Boccaccio's first story in the Decameron centers on a characteristically gullible priest, the second on the conversion of a Jew who had concluded after a visit to Rome that with the papacy so corrupt, the church had to be of divine inspiration. And the fourth on the complicity of monk and abbot in seducing a young woman. And so it went. In the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer lets the pardoner draw a chilling portrait of himself as a priest who abuses his authority and seems proud of selling false relics for financial gain. For seriously religious persons, nothing perhaps was more disturbing than the commercialization of piety, exemplified by the pardoner. In Rome, church offices were sold to the highest bidder, which was the ecclesiastical crime of simony in all but name. More widely observable was the traffic of indulgences, which, no matter what theological justification was offered, on the surface often looked like grace and forgiveness on sale at bargain prices. Everything is for sale, is how many contemporaries viewed the Roman see. In colloquies such as a pilgrimage for religion's sake and a funeral, Erasmus poked serious fun at relics, pilgrimages, wonder-working saints, apparitions of the Virgin Mary, and the petty but vicious rivalry among religious orders. In The Praise of Folly, his depiction of the scholastics' theological enterprise as vacuous and pastorally irrelevant hit home and threw oil onto the already blazing fires of theological controversy. Think Bonaventure and Thomas, the Dominicans and Franciscans, the Dominicans and Jesuits. Relics, pilgrimages, wonder-working saints, and apparitions of the Virgin Mary did in fact play a large role in the piety of the time. So did images of Christ and of the saints. To the list must be added the gaining of indulgences for oneself for the dead. In these cases, the sacramental principle of the spiritual being mediated through the material was operative, but the latter sometimes overwhelmed and suffocated the former. Reformers cried, therefore, for a more quote-unquote spiritual religion, unquote. As the Imitation of Christ, the great 15th century classic, urged in the opening chapter, quote, turn thy mind from visible things and rise to the invisible. Viewed from these perspectives, the ecclesiastical and religious situation of Europe on the eve of the Reformation looks like a landscape of unrelieved desolation. In fact, as historians have conclusively shown over the past 50 years, the situation was complex to a degree that defies summary and that challenges the negative stereotypes that still prevail in the popular media and in just popular Catholic culture. That the bishops at Trent were so intent on reforming themselves, that is, on taking it as impossible as they could for themselves and their colleagues to evade their pastoral responsibilities, shows that even among them, the situation was not so dire as previous generations believed. What is clear today is how different France was from Italy, England from Spain, and Spain from both France and Italy, and Germany from the lot. Equally clear is that diversity prevailed among different socioeconomic classes in different parts of Europe. It may be possible to judge the religious fervor of the age as misguided, but impossible to deny its intensity and vitality. Turn to 48. We return to the basic question. How bad was it? Assessments differ, depending upon what evidence is examined, and perhaps more important, upon what criteria are applied to evaluate. The age had its share of ecclesiastical rogues, benefice chasers, but also devout and dedicated churchmen. Ignorance and superstition abounded, but so did efforts to remedy. Bishops might be absentee careerists, but even in their dioceses, Christianity at the grassroots could be engaged and lively thanks to the religious orders and fraternities. Was the glass then half full, half empty, or half full, or 2/3 empty, or 2/3 full? It is best, perhaps safest, to dodge questions like these and resort to the flabby generalization that these were neither the best or the worst of times, which surely cannot take at face value reformers' sometimes perfervid denunciation of their age as utterly depraved. Nonetheless, the image of a papacy seemingly more concerned with securing ample income for itself than with providing pastorally responsible bishops was widespread. That image was grounded in the reality of the situation and made credible by flagrant violations of the most fundamental ideas and principles of canon law. On three further points, sturdy generalizations can be made. First, the Reformation could have happened only in a society passionately concerned about religion. Second, the Reformation could almost certainly not have succeeded, or succeeded as it did, had it not been for an extraordinarily important shift in political leadership that took place in Europe between 1509 and 1520. Third, that shift, along with papal fear of councils, explains the long delay in the convocation of the Council of Trent. Let's take a really quick 5-minute break, and then we're going to start the Reformation.
Turned on.
Go ahead.
Yes.
So I gave you guys a reading. Who got to read it? Part of it. What did you guys think? This really talks about on the onset of the 16th century, the beginning of the 1500s. Again, we're looking at what's leading up to the Reformation and different things at play.
We really emphasized the gap between the ideal of Christianity and practice.
What else?
From the title, I thought that, obviously this is just an excerpt from a much longer book, but I was expecting something about how the Reformation so drastically changed the social fabric of Europe, and instead it more just set up how different the social fabric was prior, without really getting into the during and after of the Reformation, just how radically different this is from our modern conception of life.
Right. Turn to page 190. So, we have the beginning of that middle paragraph on 190. It would seem that some moral rules are necessary for the existence of any sort of human community, and thus for any sustained practice of all virtues. Without a prohibition of murder and theft, for example, any human community risks radical destabilization. Medieval Christian authorities, whether ecclesiastical or secular, understood this well. But however indispensable it is to the securing of order, the following of moral rules alone, such as those of the Ten Commandments or in Jesus' uncompromising radicalizations, was regarded in medieval Christianity as insufficient for the realization of the individual good or the common good. The flourishing of individuals and communities depended on the shared practice of moral virtues and avoidance of vices, which in their best known but not exhaustive expressions in the late Middle Ages were respectively categorized and were basically taught, preached, and painted as the seven holy virtues and the seven deadly sins. Human beings could not flourish or promote the common good unless, for example, they were to a significant degree habitually diligent rather than slothful, generous rather than greedy, and kind rather than cruel. Peter Lombard's substantial treatment of the virtues in Book 3 of his Sentences ensured not only that all university-trained theologians were exposed to reflection on the virtues, their interrelationships, and their place in the Christian life, it also meant that they were lectured and often wrote commentaries on the virtues, because lecturing on the sentences was required to become a master of theology. The rational application of each of the virtues to specific circumstances amid the complexities of human life required at least implicitly the virtue of prudence, phronesis, or prudentia, which is the acquired ability to exercise each moral virtue in particular circumstances, such that it objectively conduces to individual and common flourishing. Given the medieval recognition of the human propensity for self-deprecation and prideful overestimation of one's own capacities, the necessity of prudence implied the importance of counsel, which in turn implied the trustworthy social relationships characteristic of a moral community. Keep counsel with the wise and conscientious man, Thomas Kempis wrote, paraphrasing Tobit 4:18 in one of the 5th century's most influential works of exhortative piety, and seek rather to be taught by someone who is better than to follow your own devices. Without a stable moral community, neither the rules requisite for its very existence, nor the virtues conducive to its vitality and the common good were possible. There would be neither model practitioners to imitate in one's acquisition of virtues, nor experienced virtuous counselors to consult in one's prudential deliberation. Hence, the church, as the temporal extension of the community of Jesus' followers after his ascension, interpreted and enforced what it understood to be God's rules, just as its clergy preached and exhorted one another and the laity to the practice of virtues and the avoidance of sins. To the extent that Christians practiced what they preached, they tended to overcome individually and together their predisposition towards sinful self-regard in a movement toward the imperfect eudaimonia in this life that prefigured perfect beatitudo among the community of saints of God in heaven, the final good and telos of human existence willed by God, who desires everyone to be saved and to come to the knowledge of that truth. And such was this idea. What human beings are, if left to their own devices, is not all that they can be, nor what they should be, nor what God wants them to be. This was a basic truth claim about the reality of the fallen human condition and the purpose of human life, implicit in medieval Christianity. Even after baptism conferred the grace of effaced original sin, the sin's pervasive effects continue to incline human beings to think and act in ways objectively detrimental to their well-being and to the common good. Pride rather than humility eroded human relationships through overestimation of one's worth. Wrath rather than patience damaged through violent words and actions the bonds of friendship, and therefore the community. Lust rather than chastity risked the unleashing of sexual desires in ways harmful to persons and families, and so on. To pretend otherwise was to misread human nature and to delude oneself about human relationships. Unconstrained by moral rules or undisciplined by the virtues, whatever natural inclination toward the good that human beings might have possessed was bound to be dissipated in desires, passions, and impulses that tended away from flourishing and toward individual self-absorption, not self-destruction, and the erosion of the community, all of which, even apart from divine judgment after death, were part of God's condemnation of sins in and through his created order. As a Kempis asked rhetorically, in effect echoing Augustine and the medieval Christian tradition, what hinders or afflicts you more than an uncontrolled passion of your heart? So we need to begin to understand the idea of what is a moral community, right? And there are different ways of establishing and maintaining a moral community. Brad Gregory, the author of this book, is going to go on and say we basically subjectivize moral communities, or so secularized moral communities that you sort of pick the one that you want. And that there is then no overarching moral community that can help a diverse pluralistic society to actually be able to achieve what they hope for, right? And we see some of that consequences today. But in medieval Christianity, in Europe, the moral community was much larger and understood, and that these systems naturally grew as society grew. So, this is on the eve of the Reformation. This is the mind, this is the reality, this is where we are. And we begin with the Protestant Reformation. It's the foment of discontent over the last 500 years. This is what I say, finally broke the camel's back. And we're going to rise to that question about what about me? And the growing need to take matters into one's own hands for moral communities, for moral models. You know, who's a real Christian? Obviously they're not. Who is the authority to say so? Their authority doesn't seem to be much anymore because it doesn't do what it preaches. So what about me? Who's caring for my needs? Hence the grassroots care and humanism for the pastoral concerns. And maybe I have the ability to say, and have that authority to determine who's a real Christian or not. And people take matters into their own hands. Germany, we have Luther. In 1517, we have those 95 Theses. It speaks of the immediacy and primacy of Scripture, desire to find the pristine original, uncorrupted by the institution. Sacrifice is the greatest blasphemy. Grace is God's work, not ours. What we do doesn't matter, right? Again, this is a reaction to a lot of the superstitious piety. If I but pay this indulgence, or if I do such pious acts, I can influence God's actions and God's favorability, right? A pious superstitious spirituality. We have to make sure that we understand that there's a difference between Lutheranism and Lutheran theology versus Luther's theology. Because what comes after Luther in the Lutheran branch isn't necessarily what Luther taught. Melanchthon takes it in a different direction. In England, again, we had Wycliffe, Oxford skepticism in 1534, the Supremacy Act, Henry VIII, also known as Paul Schofield in A Man for All Seasons. Is that Paul Schofield? Yeah, he was.
No, he was Thomas More.
He was Thomas More. Who's the guy's name? I know him. He was in Jaws.
Oh, the sea captain.
Yeah.
The shark.
Henry VIII is played by the shark. So,
He bites off Thomas More's head.
But Henry VIII, 1534, declares himself as the supreme leader of the church in England. In Switzerland, we have a branch known as the Reformed movement, humanist in nature. We have two main figures, John Calvin and Zwingli. Calvin's focus on self-knowledge and the knowledge of God. So maybe I'm part Calvinist. Self-awareness, self-knowledge. Doesn't mean
I've been down that road. Not that great.
seldom affirm, rarely deny, always distinguish. Right?
Let's deny
Dominic respect too. Augustine and the Confessions. The search for God and knowledge of God leads to knowledge of self.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Right?
Calvin.
And I'm not saying wholesale Calvinist, but it doesn't mean that either Luther or Melanchthon or Calvin were summarily wrong, and therefore not everything should necessarily have to be dismissed. They might even be baptized, but we end up adopting much.
Maybe conflict.
That's right. But in this extreme, again, remember, because the lack in one sense, and a lot of people taking things into their own hands, we begin to get people out of theological spectrum, of the extremes, trying to think through and understand in particular ways through the lenses of what they're experiencing in the world and what they're born into and what's inherited. So you get, and it's sort of an extreme, the total depravity of man. Double predestination. Not only does God choose some to be saved, he also creates some people who will be damned. We do not believe in double predestination. There's Zwingli. He's a humanist, and he claims that the Eucharist is fully symbolic. Right? So you have even in like the Modernity, Devotio Moderno, this seek the spiritual, what was that? The Oratory Divine Love. Where did I go? It was maybe in when you read John O'Malley. So you have, again, in Germany, so this is happening everywhere. There isn't just one Reformation. There are many Reformations. And each cultural, again, remember what John O'Malley says, Germany was very different from Italy, or England and France and Italy, and they're all different from each other, and that the great vast distinctions, and yet in each one you can see explosions of reform movements. In the Dutch, German, Swiss end, you have the Anabaptists, the forerunners of the Amish and the Mennonites. A radical reform, the emphasis to look different from the world around them. They moved to Silesia and Moravia, the sort of Czech, Poland, Bohemia area, Transylvania, Ukraine, even North America. The Catholic Reformation is also going on. What sometimes is called a Counter-Reformation, but nonetheless, the Church will, for the first time, begin to have its own reform movements. We've already sort of started talking about, like Archbishop Cisneros and University of Alcalá. We already have movements of reform through figures like Savonarola and the preachers in Hispaniola. There are already these movements, these calls that are happening within the Church itself that end up not breaking away radically. But you have the founding of new religious orders, the Jesuits, the Theatines. Why? To be new models of Christian perfection in living. One of the reasons why Dominicans and Franciscans look the way they do and were founded were what? To look the part. To actually do what we preach so that our preaching is credible. Here again, we have this coming back 300 years later. Jesuits are like us, only 300 years younger in some ways. They didn't learn in some ways.
And they can't sing.
You had deep calls for the clarification of the faith and great writing happening. We get our dear brother, St. Thomas More, not Dominican, but we all love him, right? Standing up to Henry VIII. There was a colloquy in Ratisbon in 1541 on the issue of justification. Ratisbon being in Germany, and you have the great question in the Lutheran was, how do we get to heaven? How are we justified? And yeah, it was a question that needed clarification. Because some of it were pretty legitimate, or people were voting things similar to, in those ages of the ecumenical councils, was Jesus, Jesus is God, but was he God? Right? Right? On that level. And those councils called for the need for a clarification, right? We're having a similar dynamic at the same time here. Real issues of doctrinal understanding. And so we had a colloquy to address an issue like that. There even was another council after, right on the eve of the 1517 of Luther. What also happened in 1517 is that the Ottomans take Cairo. And that's really sort of the big beginning of the Ottoman Empire. Same year. It's another big year. For the end of the 1490s, beginning of the 1500s, were really big in world history.
In the reading, the second reason in the change in political structure, what is that referring to?
Again, how I believe it was, maybe this is later, with the idea of the Dutch Republic as an experiment. You're also going to begin to see here is the foment of discontent about institutions such as monarchies. right? We begin to see some of that momentum happening. The idea of nations begins to arise and was devised. So there are a lot of those cultural shifts. I don't have a lot more specifics, but there's a lot more. Right? Germany, all over Europe. Lateran V, from 1511 to 1517, was all over the place. You know, it was still reacting to previous councils, sort of it couldn't get out of the sludge of those old, tired arguments and the old, tired feuds and, you know, grudges and carried hurts over the last 100+ years and those battles, and they couldn't seem to, they were reacting to even that, which, and also previous councils, and in one sense, became a little blind or myopic about how to actually address the real issue. But it nevertheless made attempts at reform, but not really successful, right? Even on the eve of the Reformation. The real game changer starts in Trent for the Catholic Church and the Counter-Reformation. Trent is from 1545 to 1563. Dates you should know. 1545 to 1563. There was a double tension that the bishops knew in light of what had been happening over the last 40 years, or 30 years, 20 years actually, in 1517, but really that time, was the need to define and clarify extremes, issues of orthodoxy, in the face of extremes, but not to over-define, right? Again, remember what we say, with councils tend to be very reticent to over-define things, like after the Council of Nicaea. What did they say about the Holy Spirit?
It is.
We believe in the Holy Spirit. That's it. That's called not over-defining. Right? But, so, like, it wasn't so over-define, but not over-define. For example, you have anathema sit. So Jeff Foxworthy has, you might be a redneck if. We, in church history, we might be anathema if. You might be anathema if. Anathema seats. You know, you believe and you say that you must give the Eucharist under both species, which was a Hussian claim and teaching. Jan Hus, who was condemned early. So there was this claim and this push and this call, you must give it under both species. Sometimes I have to deal with that today in a post-Vatican II church. There's a lot of that being rebranded. But the church says, no, that's anathema. It doesn't have to be, right? It's not an absolute necessity, qua the very understanding of the Eucharist. Rather, it is a lot more broad, right? It leaves for greater flexibility instead of constricting it. The same thing goes with, you must say the Mass in the vernacular. Church says, no, you don't have to. God isn't bound by language method, right? Sometimes I want to tell that to our modern liturgy warriors. I heard of a fight that broke out, I think intellectual fight, which I've got with you both over the meeting of priests, particularly a month ago, about the efficacy of English in exorcisms. That the devil is more afraid of Latin, therefore Latin, the exorcism must be done in Latin. And I look and I'm like, and not Greek. Why Latin, not Greek? They were dying on local, right? Similar ideas. Must say the Mass in the vernacular. So there's this tension about what do we define, what don't we define. This is very much a via negativa now. So in saying the Eucharist is versus let's not, it doesn't have to be this way. It leaves a lot more openness than what a lot of the people and the reformers at the time wanted to give. You see that? There were two big tensions, and it was as tenuous as being an Arian or being a non-Arian in the early church. What do we prioritize? Because at the moment, the state of the church in the midst of the Reformations had two problems. One was orthodoxy, the extreme positions and faith and teachings that were going around that needed clarification, that we began to see with the Luthers and the Zwinglies and the Calvins and everything that goes on. That needed, was that more important? Or was fixing the orthopraxis? That reform movement about behavior and how we act and do that's been the attempts since the thousands, which is the very reason that fundamentally is the inability to actually manifest in an incarnate way the faith among the people that leads to crazy unorthodoxies, right? What do you emphasize? And it was bad. I mean, the first session was huge fights. When you read the accounts of Trent, it's funny that they got anything done at all, right? Because it's fascinating. I'll just don't need to go too far into that. But which do you do first? There were political motivations. There were political tensions, methodological tensions, camps, and very bitter divisions. So you have people from, again, very different. You have the French, the Germans, and the whatever. They're already coming in with their cultural, just think of the English versus the French, right? And they divided on what was the most pressing due. They came with a compromise that actually allowed them to go forward. They would do both simultaneously. And they began to come up with an agenda. It took a while. But they decided to address both simultaneously. That wasn't obvious in the outset. What was more pressing and needed, they wasted a lot of time arguing the methodology about the council. And then they finally got to it, and what were some of the products? One was a practical one. Seminaries, orthopraxis. We have the inept priests, the negligent priests, the ignorant priests, didn't know anything. They were not warned. They were given manuals. Okay, you did that sin, they look it up. Okay, here's the thing. Right? They knew how to say mass, but they weren't watching and trained. Seminaries did not exist before they come to it. The Dominican, the religious orders didn't be more educated than the dioceses.
Still hard.
Our diocese is people school.
They learn how to say mass in Latin. They're taught whatever. Yes.
Lots of people just were barely literate.
Yeah.
More like apprenticeship kind of thing.
Apprenticeships too.
So would like
Even more
having regulars would have some type of education, but it would be an
Possibly.
institution.
Possibly, but even canon regulars was a sort of a forming of any way of religious life in the city, right?
And that wasn't, that was at, cathedrals and major churches, not a country parish in the fields of England.
Right? Your typical people where most people had access to. Right? What was that everyday exposure? So that was an example of dealing with right behavior, right action. A reform that was absolutely needed to address the pastoral concerns, to be able to be effective in addressing pastoral concerns. Right? Because the bishops, as John O'Malley says, weren't really concerned about these things too. Even if it might not seem on the surface, like they held themselves accountable, this finally, in this council. Second, they define transubstantiation. This is where Thomas gets a revivification in the life, the intellectual life of the church. Remember, we had sort of a rejection of that heady intellectualism in the 1400s, and a sort of speculative mysticism. Thomas, in his work 300 years earlier, really gave a framework and language that allowed them to be able to discuss about the nature of the Eucharist, which was thoroughly being questioned by figures like Zwingli, Calvin, and others, even the Lutheran, not necessarily Luther always, but that there needed to be that clarification, right? Practical thing, the first catechism was commissioned. Another orthodoxy thing, they canonized the Old Testament. Remember we said in the 300s, they canonized the New Testament. They said, this is the New Testament. They never did anything about the Old Testament because there never needed to be anything about the Old Testament, right? We even see Thomas Kempis paraphrasing Tobin. The Old Testament doesn't come into question in a real significant way until the 16th century. And they were denying the Apocrypha, right? The Deuterocanonical. We know that Luther did not like the book of James. Probably getting kicked out too, but they stopped. There was, and part of this too was a defining about, remember, the Lutheran idea of going back to the pristine scripture, uncorrupted by the church. And you can create arguments about, well, this is probably deuterocanonical because of these reasons, and well, look at the Jews, they don't even use this right now, and like, et cetera, et cetera. But it becomes also an identifying feature over and against the church that has corrupted things anyway. And we know better, we have the authority to determine really what's authentically scripture or not. And so the church had to say, no, these are the books of the Old Testament. A practical thing, a missal, a common missal, common practice of the Eucharist, the Mass. Just again on the orthodoxy side, doctrinal clarifications, like we sort of pointed out there. And then there were other on the orthopraxis, clerical practical norms and standards, right? As contemporary Catholics of the 21st century, the 20th century, particularly post-Vatican II, and these ideas of wanting to undo Vatican II, wanting to go back, and they call themselves, Tridentine Catholics, that the Catholic Church was unchained, that Trent somehow was the golden determiner of all things Catholic, and that's what we need to get back to, and Vatican II ruined it all. There is what Trent did, and then there's what's called the myth of Trent. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Because how Catholicism and its counter-reformation, we're going to go into this more next week as well, the effects of it cannot separate from the cultural, political, economic moment either. And though the council said it is anathema to say that the Mass must be in the vernacular, as the Reformers were calling for, the Catholic Church, the Catholic people began to say, well, we're going to not do it in the vernacular because that's what Reformers do, and we don't want to be associated with that. We are true Catholics, we're going to sing Latin, right? It became more of a cultural identity over and against Reformers, and the same thing Reformers did as well. We don't do what the Catholics do. We do this because They're corrupt. We're the ones that are reforming Christianity as it's needed to have for the last 500 years plus. We're going to write it. We have the authority to say who's a Christian and who's not. Again, a lot of that Catholic identity that leads into the French Revolution, even into the recovery, the Reconstruction after the French Revolution of Catholicism, were based on this kind of Tridentine but Reformation identifying or counter-reform identifying features, and forgets or it can confuse what is the faith and what is the culture. So to look at what Trent actually said versus what we think it said, or actually what it meant versus what we think it meant. And that's a problem for us today. And we're dealing with a lot of those questions. We see that influence of the myth of Trent in the tensions that we experience in the Catholic Church today. But the issues really aren't issues about the faith. It's about something different. It's about identity. Who are we? And the fear of losing one identity, or wanting to secure or defend. Yes.
So before Trent, were there any missiles around that you know of in the vernacular in the Roman Church?
I don't know. I would imagine so. At least, we have translations of the Bible into the vernacular, not outside of the Latin. We have vernacular Bibles being gave in this time. Yeah.
I asked Father Dave about this. So Lateran 4 actually, Lateran 4 actually called for parts of the liturgy to be put into the vernacular, and it says in the canons of the council, we want this so that people are better able to pray while they're at mass. It's something we very much recognize as active participation. I asked Father Dave,
versus the idea that people were just there, they would see it and they walk away. Right?
Great.
Used to do.
So I asked Father Dave about this. I was like, why does Lateran 4 say this? Did this ever happen in the Middle Ages? And basically, I've never seen anything to suggest that it did. So they basically ignored that. From that, I'd assumed that it was probably not done at any point prior. I mean, maybe you had translations for personal use, but I would assume that would probably be relegated to people in training for priesthood, and that's definitely speculation.
Or it might have happened and it was just not written down.
Probably not.
Unlikely.
Because you also have what is the cultural expectation, particularly in light of the Reformation and everything that follows it. To want in the vernacular is in one sense to capitulate or betray your people. You become a lapse sense. So we'll move on. So you have these two movements. You have the reform movements, the counter-reform movements. There's a lot going on. We cannot talk about one Reformation. But hopefully you guys have a better understanding of everything that led up to the Reformation. Why? What were those seeds? And in many respects, I can understand why it happened. And it's not just reformers because they decide to be crazy and selfish or whatever, they're at fault. No. A lot of the blame is placed on the church itself. And it's a consequence of human sinfulness, right? Division. I think that's a reality to take note of. So to go back and judge the Reformation of the Reformers, morally is a very dubious, anachronistic, and perhaps arrogant thing to do. But to have an understanding of where they're coming from, it's very difficult to be in their place today. But we certainly are the inheritors of the church that they ended up leading, particularly the American Catholic Church. And part of that development of that identity and the symbols and the trappings that we've come to know as the Catholic Church happens in the aftermath of Trent and the Reformation. You had the rise of what is called confessionalism. Nations, kingdoms, but nations began to be identified with particular forms of Christianity. And remember too, medieval Christianity and the time of this era too, the relationship between faith and civilization was huge. What's at stake is the unity of the faith. And the unity of the faith means the stability of civilization itself. Not everybody's going to be in the same moral community. Who is going to be able to protect or maintain those checks and balances against all-out anarchy? If you look at the map that I gave you, you begin to see overlaid on in Europe, sort of where these different groups begin to see a fracturing of the unity of Christianity in very national ways, cultural identities, right? And those can also lead to wars and fights, and did. France isn't as, the France we know today, and wasn't as unified, just as like the Italy we know of today, had killed many kingdoms before. The Holy Roman Empire, we see England, we see Scotland, and we can see the different kinds of, whether Calvinist, Lutheran, Catholic, Anabaptist, Orthodox, et cetera, you can begin to see those interlays and interplays between the different, Christian theologies. And it was very, very tenuous. Again, the very stability of civilization is at stake, and people will defend it. It's also really the very first time in which the issues of reform and the issues of, the hierarchy and all that sort of stuff seep into communities in an unprecedented way. Is your neighbor a reformer or a Catholic? And we see this played out in the movie A Man for All Seasons, where Thomas More's daughter is in love with a reformer. And Thomas More says, I will not give you permission to marry him. Right? Social stability, welfare, neighbor against neighbor. This could mean civil war. This could mean, bedlam in cities, in towns, between lords, right? How do we identify? Kind of sounds familiar in many respects of our political divisions today. I'm sorry?
I was thinking, or even racism.
Or even racism.
Border states during the Civil War.
The Civil War, yeah. Amen. In 1555, there was a détente of sorts, the peace at Augsburg, which established the cuius regio, eius religio, whose reign is religion. So if the king of Germany was a Lutheran, all of Germany was a Lutheran. No Lutherans. The king of France is French.
Catholic.
Everybody in France is French, or all the French are Catholic.
Everything that being
Sorry.
Catholic is a religion.
Well, before the French Revolution, yes.
Sorry. The king of France is Catholic. French are Catholics, right? But even that leads in many respects, because of the wars that will be fought and the blood that gets spilled, you get to this is the beginning of a seeds of you do you, and we'll do we. Because if we try to unite, we're going to kill each other. When we see that, St. Bart's Day Massacre, 1572, St. Bartholomew's Day, 20,000 French Protestants died at the hands of French Catholics. One day, huge massacre, 20,000 Protestants. In England, of course, we had Henry VIII and Bloody Mary, right? We had Queen Elizabeth and her sort of war against the Catholics and establishing her own power with the church. Then you have the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648. It starts as a conflict in the Holy Roman Empire, a Protestant North versus Catholic South. You know, the Bavaria area where Pope Benedict is from, very, very Catholic. This is the Protestant North. But gradually involves the great powers in Europe. This could very well be like the First World War, right? It's the bloodiest conflict in Europe to date. Until Napoleon. Napoleon comes in on the scene at the end of the 1700s, early 1800s. This is the bloodiest conflict, and Europe is so committed. 7 million people died. Now, that's a lot, obviously. But back then, it was even more. 1/3 of the Holy Roman Empire was killed. In World War I, 1/5 of the male of French men, the French male population was killed. 1/5. The existence of nations is at balance. And that's why the United States becomes, in many respects, the great experiment that did. How in the world is freedom of religion in a single nation going to work? Because the history of the last 150 years has been nothing but bloodshed. Europe is looking at the United States and its founding like, these guys are nuts. It's never going to work. And we even have confessionalism really started. It's the founding of the colonies. Quaker, Pennsylvania. You have Dutch New York. New Amsterdam. That's where New York's original name. Mary's Land. aka Maryland. Baltimore. The heart of Catholicism in the United States. Right? You had these things. And the founders establishing for a more perfect union, this idea of a freedom of religion and you do you, to try to take to when kingdoms can't fix themselves and those old institutions fail and it's all they know and all they know how to do to resolve their problems, we have a revolution. Democratic revolution, which is, you know, who is a real American who has the authority to say so, or who is a real Brit who has the authority to say so. That question about what about me comes up again, right? The American Revolution. The product, what I see, and we're going to be laying this out, what I try is that this humanistic movement, this introduction of the third question of in the middle of the 1400s will have 3 cycles that lead to today. So this question about the what about me and the beginning of the masses taking authority unto themselves to determine who's a real Christian, but also justifiably to demand their dignity and rights to be pastorally cared for and call people to account, right? To wield that moral authority as well. It's both and. Protestant Reformation is the first sort of explosion attempt of that tension, that new dynamic, because it's not just between the church and the state. It's between the church, the state, and the people. And the Protestant Reformation is the first sort of big thing, and it tries to, in many respects, ease the tensions, but it leads to a bloody mess, right? In the 30 Years' War. There's attempts at more, coming back again where institutions fail. The second big blow up is the French Revolution, which leads to a bloody mess. And even more so, really Christianity, we don't want anything to do with Christianity. And even though it led into a bloody mess, the principles of humanism still didn't die, continues on, and is in the beginnings of the 20th century, fomented by reactionism in the 19th century. But in the eve of World War I and World War II, we are at the height of civilization, we have democracy, we're the most intelligent, we have science, et cetera, we don't superstitious, whatever. And it leads to World War I and World War II, which ends in a bloody mess. Hitler, Stalin, these people are saying, I am your savior, and I am the solution to your problems. And I'm going to tell you who to blame, right? And people were hungering for leadership. And then it leads to a blood mess. That's the eve of Vatican II. Vatican II didn't deal with theological issues. Really, it dealt with, where are we? And Vatican II ends up baptizing and confirming the roots and the principles of the discontent and the valid critiques that we've been seeing over the last 1,000 years. And as the church has experienced, and says, finally, all right, we're gonna, if you leave it to the devices of anybody and everybody, we're going to see this in the scripture movement. We're going to see this again. We see this in the secular scientific movements. The church isn't really in that conversation. It's reacting well. It says, now we're going to begin to put our voice in, and we're going to do it according to what the gospel actually says. And that begins with post-Vatican I, starts at Leo XIII and beginnings of Catholic social teaching. Barder. And then the principles of fraternité, égalité, and liberté, which are, again, liberty, fraternity, equality, those tensions that are socioeconomic, class, political, etc. The Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution begins to identify those, what that actually looks like. We have a discourse, an explication of what is the role of the laity, collegiality of bishops. All of this leads to those questions. We are still now a post-Vatican II church. We are still working out what Vatican II gave in big parts as we're living into those realities. How are we reacting to it? Just as how are the counter-reformers reacting to Trent, right? And what became Catholic practice, a lot of it dealing with culture in reaction against the reformers. Same thing happens after Vatican II. You have what did Vatican II actually say versus the myth of Vatican II. And it's on both sides of the spectrum. The spirit of Vatican II, continuity, discontinuity. Who's right? And I'm going to define myself over and against the other. This is nothing new. We've done this before, it will all happen again. But to think that we are some way not at all linked to the past in a very significant and direct way, particularly in this era, we would be deluding ourselves. And we need to be aware, that's that trend. We inherit all of this tension. It defines how America defines itself. Read Mazzucchelli's memoirs of the 1800s as an Italian coming into the United States in mission territory and discussing the relationships between Protestants and Catholics. They're still fighting their great-great-grandparents' wars of the 16th century or the 17th century, right? And those instituted biases. My grandparents, if you walk into a Catholic church, it's tantamount to going to hell. And Protestants on the other way. If you walk into a Catholic church, you are putting your soul in danger. English calling Catholics the papists. Where do you think we get the Irish Catholics versus the Protestant North Irish? All of this is the inherited things and how our identity as Catholics and Christians, we're born into this. We love our families. We love our country. We love our communities. We want to defend the things that are good. But we have to ask ourselves, what are we fighting about again? And why? Because sometimes we just get swept in to this big wave and we have very little power to shift it. It's so massive. The currents are so strong. What kind of United States are we born into? What concepts of freedom? Right? And if we too easily anachronize our contemporary concepts and definitions of freedom, equality, et cetera, and put them on a medieval Christian mind thing, you're not going to understand what happened why. Right? And that's part of integrity of mind as well as integrity of heart. The last 4 classes have really been, the last 3 classes and today, leads to this turning point. We needed to tell that story. Right? Who is a real Christian? Who has the authority to say so? All those different threads that lead to that, to understand why this happened in the 16th century. The consequences of that define us today. So remember, the goal of this class isn't to cover everything, we can't. But I am telling a story and making the argument of the connectedness from the very beginning of Christianity to today. But why we look the way that we do today. Particularly the way we experience Christianity as American, Euro-rooted Roman Catholics of the Midwest, which is going to look different than a Peruvian Christianity. They have never really ever had to deal with the cultural injection of a post-Reformation Catholicism and those battles and baggage that they carry culturally, like we do in the United States and in Canada and in Europe. Why even the Eastern Catholic Church care less about half the things that we get our knickers on in the bunch. What does Catholicism have to look like? Right? Why Pope Benedict allows for an Anglican ordinary to maintain an Anglican rite. Does everybody have to be Roman Catholic and Romish? What is the opportunity for a multiculturalism? That unity of a unified Roman Catholicism that every Catholic everywhere looks the same comes from a mid-1800 view of Catholicism and a real reaction against national expressions. Get to that. One single unified Roman Missal, 1800s. Gregorian chant, 1800s. Recovered. Sort of dug up. Nobody knew what it was until the mid-1800s. You get some resurgence. You see where I'm going? Why anti-modernism? Why the syllabus of errors? Why Rerum Novarum? Right? Why do we have Little Sisters 24, French School of Spirituality, et cetera, et cetera? All is stemming from here. Thoughts, questions, reactions? I see the thing that numbers.
It's not pious.
I just destroyed everything you or assume. I want you to get a new app. You haven't had 5, but trust me.
No, he asked 5 questions within like 5 minutes, so then I stopped counting the 4 questions instead.
Do you have comments, questions? Thoughts? Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, shall be put world without end. Amen. Yes, for yes.
No, they're 2 different prayers. One for glory to the Father, the other is glory be to the Father.
I need to take a phone call.